What up, Silas here? This is going to be a two-part question. It's the same topic, but two different questions. Excuse the wind, it's been raining here. Okay, this is about people talking about different countries. When you're talking about, let's say, you see something in Japan and you say, this has happened in Japan, we should try having it here in the United States of America. When people say that, first of all, people normally ignore the homogeneity of a country like Japan, or they talk about Sweden. So not even the size is another question, but they don't talk about how some of these countries are like in the high 90%. Like in Japan, it's 98% Japanese in general. So that's a culture and also mostly racial. When it comes to that point, it is a racial group. So why do people on the left ignore that fact when they talk about places like Japan and a lot of the Scandinavian places? I know the Scandinavian demographics are changing vastly right now with the waves of immigration, but when it comes to Japan, why do they ignore that? Now, people on the right politically will often say, oh, they're ignoring this homogeneity, homogeneity, homogeneity. But a lot of these people on the right, I asked them, you're talking about homogeneity. What do you mean? What is white homogeneity? Again, when it comes to the whole size thing, how are you going to have a country like Japan or a country like Sweden when you talk about that situation? Those are much smaller countries than the United States of America. Although I think Japan might be in the hundreds of millions. I need to double check that. But how are you going to get to the point where that's homogeneous? Now, the Japanese aren't letting in Koreans, they're not letting in Chinese people, they're not letting in Burmese, they're not letting in the 42 different tribes here in Kenya, they're not letting in people from South Africa, they're not letting in Swedes. So they are also a culture. So when you talk about the Japanese race in that sense, when you're talking about, yes, we need to have homogeneity here in the United States of America or in Europe, what does that mean? Because in one aspect they say, yes, you can be white and still be diverse in a different kind of sense, but then they say we want white homogeneity. So using that term Japanese as a race, inferring that's a race, and then comparing that to something like blacks and whites, I don't think that's appropriate. Even something like the Swedes, I think there is actual racial and cultural and ethnic diversity within Europe. The Scandinavians can be a group, then you go within there's different Swedish people. If you talk to the Swedish people, they probably see an Icelandic person, they're like, oh, I can probably tell that person's Icelandic. Just how here in Kenya, you can't say it's just like one group of people. 42 different tribes, somebody can look at somebody and be like, okay, this is from that person is from that tribe. They're normally pretty good at telling that just from looking at somebody because there are actual differences. So when you have this situation when you're comparing certain things like the Japanese, talking about that being a race, and then saying they have homogeneity in that sense, and you're comparing it to homogeneity or some kind of racial group of whites and blacks, I don't think it's an apples and oranges comparison. It's more like comparing apples and oranges in one sense, talking about the Japanese and Scandinavians and stuff like that, or the Swedes, and then comparing that when you're comparing it to blacks and whites, that's like comparing apples and oranges to orchards of citrus plants and whatever kind of plant apple is, which I'm going to check. Might leave it below. If you guys know, just let me know. I'm not going to. Well, I'll check anyway. So yeah. Okay, Silas here. So I just checked on the apples thing, and the apples are in the genus of Malus, and subtribe Melanea, tribe Malay, and there's something up here in the order. It's Rosales. So apples are Mexican. Should build a wall and keep them out too. And citrus go with what's the citrus genus? It's tribe Citrea, family Rutia. So Plantae is where they share it. So yes, and it turns out that apples are actually false fruits because they talk about the way fruits actually are classified is by the part of the flower that turns into the fruit. That's what actually makes it the part of the plant that turns into the actual fruit makes it the fruit. So I just found out apples are also false fruits. So this even adds more intricacy and more difference to that whole saying of comparing apples to oranges. So yes, this whole thing with the race thing, if you're talking about homogeneity and you're talking about something like the Japanese and considering them a race, but then you compare them to whites and blacks, that goes even higher to the whole situation where you're talking about apples and oranges compared to orchards of citrus and malinea or malus of malus. Yes, and no, it's really disingenuous in my opinion when people talk about these things and they don't talk about that, especially when people come talking about the socialism thing and situations like that, and they talk about certain countries, and you often see that where it's like, look, these countries are socialist and they work. They have democratic socialism or whatever. They talk about countries in Scandinavia. Now, even if those countries actually are that way, you're also ignoring the homogeneity, which hardly ever comes up in that thing. And in those situations, I normally ask, so what you're saying is we need less brown people, because the countries they often pick are white countries, or however you want to define that, in the homogeneity in that kind of situation. When they talk about gun control, they'll talk about places like Japan and things like that. And in Japan, that's another country where there's like the homogeneity is there. It's the culture is there. They have a entirely different culture when it comes to just societies and cultures that go in shame and guilt, which should be discussed in a separate video. But yeah, that's it for this. Okay, actually, I just thought of one more thing. Now, with the apples and oranges thing, since apples are false fruits, maybe apples and oranges is all you need to say. Or maybe you need to say oranges to orchards of apples or something like that, or orchards of Maluses, since technically saying black and white is kind of a false race, yet people kind of use it. So maybe it's like using apples to oranges to Mexicans, Japanese and Mexicans. I don't know. What do you guys think? Because when people say Japanese, I think people think race. Then when some people say Mexican, people say Mexicans are not a race. Accurately so, because Mexican is a nationality and so is Japanese. Then you talk about some places like Israel or Jewish. You can be Jewish and you can be like of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish people. You can be of the Jewish faith, or you can, no, if you're an Israeli, you're an Israeli or an Israelite. Or is an Israelite just the older ones? They still say Israelites? Well, anyway, yeah, so maybe the false fruit thing, maybe you just need apples and oranges, because comparing Japanese people to white or black people is kind of a false race when you're talking about whites and blacks. So maybe that's all you need to say. But anyway, that's it for now. I'm going to end the video here. Like, share, and subscribe. Links below to the merchandise store. Shall be uploading more there. Let me know what you guys think about these comparisons. Why do people leave these things out? And why do people kind of juxtapose a situation where I think is not really practical to juxtapose that into their own situation? I know I try to lessen myself doing this, but I know it's very convenient to do this to kind of fit the narrative that you have. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Goodbye.